ground rules. I give you all the diamonds and money, but you can't break my heart, cause that'll just get you fired. And everybody needs a job. Work is scarce, competition is fierce.
Hey class, today I want to talk to you about our unit on bourgeois rule and bourgeois revolt. And before I get into that, I wanted to lay out for you the transition from Aristotle through Christian politics and colonialism up to the bourgeois period in Europe. So that's a lot of territory, and it's going over things that we haven't read, but I want to try to connect the dots for you so you see where this is coming from. So we left off in Aristotle. Aristotle had given us the idea of political rule, which is the idea of a form of government in principle between equals who alternate between their rule. And this is Aristotle's idea of an ideal constitution. This is his sort of twist on democracy. So after having gone through some of the problems with democracy in Plato, Aristotle goes one step further and articulates what would it look like to actually have a philosophical justification of democracy. And there are two elements to that. One is this idea of political rule, and the other element is the distinction between the good citizen and the good person, or the good man in Aristotle's terms. Why is that relevant? Well, because it helps establish the idea that being a good person in general, that goes into what Plato would see as a philosophical question, this kind of universal idea. However, being a good citizen, which Aristotle separates apart, allows for everyone to manifest their own good differently in society. And so it's the grain, sort of the kernel of an idea, that there could be an idea of the political good broad enough to apply to different people in different ways. This would seemingly be necessary if there was going to be a democratic justice, one that in principle it makes sense for everyone to participate in constructing. When you combine that with Aristotle's idea of political rule, you get the idea of multiple people, all considered equal and free, alternating rule based on different ideas of the good, but their different ideas of the good coming together in one sort of larger idea of the good, which is multiple participation in creating the good, a society of free individuals combining to participate in defining the good. And that's as far as Aristotle gets in the direction of thinking democratically. However, on the other hand, Aristotle also gives us the doctrine of the natural slave, where Aristotle carves right into the heart of his political theory the idea that some people are going to have to be outside of this free alternating political rule thing. Why? Because as a matter of course, all political societies need to reproduce themselves to sort of create food, create all this hard labor. And hard labor is not going to allow enough time to be politically active. It's not going to allow you the time to do that kind of free, creative sort of thing. And so Aristotle speculates that there will always be a class of laborers who are going to be outside the political process. And then he takes another step and says, and the people who kind of are going to drift down into that are naturally suited for it. It's a sign that they were supposed to be there. Although just as soon as he says that, if you read that closely, you notice Aristotle quickly points out, well, it's almost impossible that we'd ever be able to actually identify a natural slave. And so Aristotle's there admitting the idea that this is a very problematic idea to begin with. So we leave Aristotle and Greek philosophy with this moment of Greek democracy caught between the contradictions of what can make it genuinely just, in other words, true, and then who's included in it. And Aristotle gives us the closest idea in this version of political friendship, but he also poses the radical limit with this idea of the natural slave. After Aristotle, Aristotle's student was Alexander the Great, which gives you the clue to the end of the world of Greek city-states and their separate ideas of justice. Alexander of Macedon established the massive empire that would unite all of the Greek city-states and connect it to the rest of Europe. And after that, you have the rise of the Roman Empire. And so it's the shifts from the age of isolated city-states to the age of empire. And with the Roman Empire, we find radically different justice needs. Instead of individual societies trying to decide their own idea of justice, the Roman Empire was in need of a doctrine capable of uniting people from all over the world, the Mediterranean world certainly. And it's into that problem, into that question of how can you incorporate some of the things that were learned from Greek democracy with an ideology capable of unifying all kinds of people who have no participation in their determination of justice. And it's into that problem that in walks Augustine. So Augustine writes his book City of God in the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire, and Augustine, his fundamental idea is a distinction between a city of God and a city of man. And just to summarize it quickly so we can keep moving, the city of God is sort of this heavenly afterworld. And for the city of God, Augustine posits this idea of a universal equality, a universality, and very importantly, it's a universality that goes beyond any natural border, any national border also. There's no limit to the city of God. Everyone's in principle, in potentiality, a citizen of it. And so this is sort of the most universal. On one hand, Augustine's idea of justice is the most universal that we've encountered so far, or that you would have encountered so far. However, on the other hand, that universality, that extreme universality of the city of God is outside of this world. It's an otherworldly idea. It's in heaven. We're all equal. However, in this world, in the city of man, because we've fallen from the city of God, we've fallen into a world of relative injustice and particularism. And so Augustine's idea of universality turns, and on the other hand, he argues that if you want to get to heaven, what you need to do is accept the power relations as they are. So you need to accept that the emperor is the emperor, and you need to accept, if you're a slave, that you're a slave, because your target is a sort of other world, an otherworldly justice. And so this sort of extreme contradiction of Augustinian justice is total universal justice in the next world, in the other world of heaven, very strict domination in this world, and partial division. So this was if you see the line moving from Aristotle through Augustine, you're shifting from a local democracy where rule is justified. The people who are kicked out of that free and equal political rule is justified by a natural difference. Augustine says, naturally, we're all free and equal at the level of being equally God's children. However, that freedom and that equality are not of this world. They're something that can only connect to us indirectly, and in fact, justify inequality in this world. That idea gets lasts for several centuries, and it is resurrected and gets one of its most powerful applications that transforms it forever in the experience of the European colonization of the Americas. So when Europe sets out to colonize America, or rather it discovers what it originally thought of as the West Indies, and of course it's encountering Hispaniola and North and South America and the indigenous peoples that are living there. When they returned, they had to answer a difficult question if they wanted to, in fact, conquer, which is what Spain and Portugal initially did want to do. By what right can we do this? By what right can we rule over completely different peoples who aren't Christians, who don't even have that framework? And the first attempt was to use that kind of Augustinian universal idea, which was, God has intended this world to be ruled by Christianity ultimately. And so the Pope, at the time, the Catholic Pope, divided the world into areas that Spain had the right to rule and areas that Portugal had the right to rule. This was the Treaty of Tordesillas. And in this idea, that sort of Christian otherworldly universality was used to give a justification for colonialism. However, that brought with it a lot of problems because it made the source of authority this otherworldly figure, in other words, the Pope. And it didn't give as much power to the king as the king wanted, in this case, King Philip. And so in this kind of context, a new type of thinking was born, which was international law, and the thought of international law and natural law. So instead of deriving things from a godly resource, in some ways it was a return to a more Aristotelian way of thinking about the sources of justice in natural law. And the key figure here is Vittoria. And Vittoria argued, we can't rely on the Pope to give us the right to colonize, because in fact, at the level of natural law, at the level of what everyone is due, we don't have the right to colonize them. They're free and independent people, and all people, by their own natures, have the right to be independent. However, and here comes the twist of the knife, Vittoria says they have an equal right to the idea of international legality, but that also means that they are held accountable to it. And so, as Vittoria argued, if their societies were in any way judged to be unjust by the principles of universal law, by natural law, then the Europeans would have the right to invade in order to fix their societies, in order to render them just. They wouldn't have a right to rule over them forever, only insofar as they were unjust. And a second one is they had the right to bring their ideas of Christianity to them and offer them to them. And the indigenous societies were obligated to receive them. And if the indigenous peoples attacked when the Europeans were bringing their gift of Christianity, then the Europeans would have the right to self-defense, which might lead up to, for instance, conquering their countries. So what's important to understand here in this transition from Augustine to Vittoria is a shift from the universality being a divine one in the next world to a universality of international law. In other words, what's now universal are these principles of human nature that help us understand what an international law would be like. In other words, anybody who's human, no matter where they are, we can derive certain conclusions. Like, for instance, they have the right to govern themselves, according to Vittoria. And so natural law became this resource for a more this-worldly, a more grounded idea of universal justice. And that also plays out in the example of Martin Luther. And the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, when the Pope's power over politics was seriously challenged in a very historically important way. So Martin Luther is another important moment in that. But with the idea of natural law versus divine law, we are now in a place where we can take a look at what's happening in the Putney debates, which is the first text that you're reading this week. So let's see. So the Putney debates emerge in the context of a lot of developments in England. One had been a whole series of struggles around religion in England, and the attempt to impose a church connected directly to the king in England. And so there had been a whole series of conflicts about the relationship between religion and political power. And in the lead up to Cromwell's revolution and Cromwell's overthrowing of the king, one of the big struggles had been the exclusion of the sort of middle class of English society. So there had been a parliament, but the parliament excluded from its ranks a whole class of people who had started to crop up. And to understand what's going on here, you have to think side by side of both political and economic developments. So economically speaking, 17th century England had seen a huge expansion of the bourgeois middle class. And the word bourgeois, of course, comes from the word for town, or, the bourg. And so the bourgeois were the townsfolk. And this sort of class of people had become increasingly prosperous over the time period leading up to the English Revolution. There had been a major innovation at the level of agriculture, which was the advent of capitalism. And capitalism involved trying to accumulate a profit from the way that you did agriculture. So instead of this idea of a sort of a cyclical idea of agriculture where you grow your crops enough to feed yourself and then you make enough profit to pay for the lives of the farmers. So you make, your goal there is to reproduce what you produce every year so you can keep on being a farmer. And then whatever profit there is goes into being able to live your life. The innovations behind capitalism are complicated, and that would be a separate lecture. But suffice it to say, one of the major innovations was using the profits that were made to improve the mechanism of agriculture. So invest in things like the Industrial Revolution, invest in manufacture, invest in new modes of fertilizing and increasing the yield of your agriculture. And as that was expanding, they were increasingly able to hire peasants who had been expropriated from their land. So peasants who had been been able to kind of live off the land in this not very productive but sustainable agriculture. As they were displaced from their property, the capitalists, early capitalists who accumulated a certain profit and then reinvested it, were able to hire them as wage workers, and so pay them a wage after they had been kicked off their land to work basically on the land that they had been kicked off of. And so this created a whole new type of social class. Instead of merely the sort of aristocracy versus the peasants, which had existed for centuries, once again, you get a growing middle class that starts to creep closer and closer to the aristocracy in terms of power. And if you remember from our discussion of Athens, part of what triggered Athenian democracy was the relative weakness of the aristocrats in Greece, and that they needed to turn, like Cleisthenes, for example, they needed to turn to the peasants, to the Greek peasants in that case, for support. And that's what motivated the establishment of the Assembly of the Demes and the rise of democracy in Athens. Something really similar starts to happen in 17th century England, which is that as this middle class starts to explode and really starts to grow in size, both in the countryside and then more and more in the towns as industry starts to really boom, this group, who had no aristocratic rights, they hadn't descended from anybody, and so they had no power from that source, began to sort of clamor for their recognition and clamor for their share of political power. And it's in this context that eventually they decided to confront the parliament, and they seized parliament, took it over, and captured the king, and ended up, in fact, executing the king. And all of a sudden, the new model army, who is this military group under Oliver Cromwell, found themselves in position to attempt to determine the laws and the principles of England, of the entire country. They had succeeded in their revolution much more dramatically than they had anticipated, and they found themselves in this position, and they were forced to decide, what shall our policies be now that we actually are in this position? And this is an important difference. This is why the situation in England in the 17th century, in the 1600s, is much more dramatic than the situation in Athens. In Athens, you had aristocrats who had decided that they needed to recruit the sort of common man, if you will. In England, the common people actually succeeded, and by common, let's be careful here, we're still talking about a middle class, but a much broader swath of society decided to take power for themselves. And so they're in a position trying to decide how shall we establish society. So this is the condition of the Putney debates. Now, in that context, the issue that we're especially looking at is the right to vote. And two big positions get articulated. One by William Rainsborough, and Rainsborough was both the two major discussants, Rainsborough and then his opponent is Ireton. Both came from the landed class. Neither of them were poor by any stretch. But Rainsborough makes the following point. If we've all fought for this revolution and we've won back power from the king, why shouldn't we have the right to vote? And in fact, and here he goes right to the heart of the issue, He says, I think that the poorest person in all of England, just by the right of having been born, should have the right to vote and participate. If not, what else were we fighting for? And he grounds it in a natural law, in the idea of natural right. And remember, I had mentioned earlier Vittoria, and this sort of shift from theological to natural law justification of politics. This is what Rainsborough is drawing on. He's saying, well, now that we're in this position to sort of create social laws, sort of ex nihilo, why don't we turn to this idea of natural law? Why don't we turn to this idea of, well, what are the natural rights of human beings? And challenging that, in comes Ireton. Now, Henry Ireton was higher ranking than Rainsborough, and he realizes immediately, and in some ways Ireton is the most perceptive person in the debate. Ireton says, look, if you ground the right to vote and the right to political power in the natural condition of human beings, the natural rights that human beings are intrinsically free and therefore they have a right to participate in politics, that principle will have no natural stopping point. That principle will just expand outwards and outwards and outwards, and before you know it, we're going to have to let even the poor masses vote. And now here immediately he says, if we let all of the poor masses vote, why would they accept a society in which that there even are aristocrats, in which there even is property? Why would all of the peasants working on your farm, and now he's speaking directly to this new capitalist class, why would all of the wage workers and peasants on your farm agree that you should have the right of property over that whole farm and make them work on it instead of distributing that right all amongst them? In fact, why should there even be the right to this different level of property that allows one person to employ another and to make them work for them? And Ireton makes even one further step. He says, look, if the right to vote comes from human freedom and equality, why can't anybody who shows up in England at any time, even say an immigrant or a visitor, why can't they vote on English law? And so Ireton, to pick up on what we were talking about a week ago in terms of the contradictions of democracy, Ireton raises to the highest level this democratic limit contradiction. In other words, if after all of these philosophical transformations that sort of Plato and Aristotle and then this whole theo-religious politics that we haven't talked about so much, if all of these things have helped the democratic truth condition in building this new idea of natural law, this is going to set up a huge clash over the limit condition. This is going to set up a huge clash over, now once we have this idea of the universal freedom and equality of human beings, you know, what could possibly be the legitimate reason for the boundary of there even being in England? And so this sets up a great and terrible clash. And the two halves of the debate are person, which is a sort of stand-in for the idea of natural right, and property, which is this idea of the limit condition, already built into democracy, but now emerging as a principle of capitalist society. The limit of justice is property. If you have property, and to the extent that you have property, a certain type of justice comes with it. Now, as you're reading Ireton, be careful to not make a caricature of Ireton, because a lot of what he's trying to say is not merely trying to clutch onto his privilege, although he's certainly also doing that, but he's really trying to think about where does the right to participate in politics come from? Shouldn't there be some kind of connection between being actually invested in a situation and being able to be politically affected by it? This issue is at the forefront this Thursday, actually. This very Thursday, 2016, June 23rd. Why? Because the very country in which this issue was first talked about is now trying to decide whether, how it will establish its borders of sovereignty. And I'm speaking of Brexit. I'm speaking of the vote that's going to happen this Thursday in the United Kingdom as to whether they should stay in the European Union or not. And if you take a look at that debate, right at the heart of it is an issue over by what right should French people be able to vote and make laws that have some impact on English people? And conversely, by what right do English people have the right to vote and make laws for French people? Shouldn't there be limits to sovereignty? And don't those limits have something to do with property, after all? And so I'm going to post up an article about that I'd like you to think about while you are reading the Putney debates. But however, the story doesn't end with the Putney debates, because after several decades, an important twist happens in the story. And that important twist comes with our friend John Locke. Now, Locke was, in many ways, a believer in the idea of natural rights. And the reason why I included our first excerpt is so you can see how he thinks that you can derive most of the ideas of justice from an idea of what's natural about humanity. And so he starts with a famous idea of the state of nature, and he derives from that a lot of his ideas of what justice should look like. And in fact, Locke, speaking as a revolutionary, gives one of the strongest defenses for revolt ever given by a philosopher. He argues that the right to legislation comes from the consent of the governed, the tacit consent. And because that consent is the ground of all legislation and all law, if a situation arises that you cannot imagine the people consenting to, if the government attempts to pass a law or the government does something that violates that consent, the people then have a right to revolt, a right to resist. And so Locke gives, famously, in his idea of democracy, Locke is one of the first philosophers to ever give a right to revolution. So this is sort of Locke's revolutionary side. However, there's another side here, and the other side is wherein he gives the very first major philosophical defense of the idea of private property. And this is why I included a long segment where we can read Locke's idea of private property. And what's fascinating about how Locke defends property is he also argues that it's natural, and so he tries to give a naturalistic argument for where does property come from. And his suggestion is that it has to do with this, the way in which if we use something, it becomes ours by right, if we can actually use it. And so that seems all well and good, and it seems like it wouldn't lead to any of the kind of injustices that Rainsborough was talking about in the Putney debates, except for one key twist, which is with the advent of money, you can accumulate property and use it later. So the issue is, there's not such a big danger of people accumulating too many potatoes because they would go bad, and you have no right to things that you can't use. But if you can convert it into money, you can accumulate as much as you want and use it at a later occasion. This is half of the problem. And the second twist comes with, not only do you have the right to accumulate it, but you also have an imperative to improve whatever your property is. Why? Because if you use that same acre of land to feed 2 people instead of 1 person, you're giving back to humanity at large, and so you have an imperative to improve your property as best as possible. Now, and here's the final twist, if somebody somewhere isn't using their property to the best of their abilities, all of the sudden you have a right to displace them if you can make their property more profitable than them and employ them. And here Locke gives a justification for the rise of capitalism. He gives a fundamental defense of those property relations on the justification that they expand the overall goods available to human beings. And it's no surprise, perhaps, that Locke then, in fact, goes on to ally himself very strongly with this capitalist middle class that was represented earlier by Ayrton. Now, what's interesting is the sort of transition that I want you to really understand when we're talking about the Putney debates and Locke is that this argument that began very much as a revolutionary challenge to the king. So the bourgeois revolution was originally this move for democracy, and that's captured in that first excerpt by Locke, and it's also captured in the Putney debates. The bourgeois began as a major revolutionary movement And of course that goes on, and you could say also, we could have also read the French Revolution and the American Revolution were bourgeois revolutions, whether you're talking about Washington and Jefferson, or whether you're talking about um, uh, the French Revolution and the figures there. You're talking about middle class figures. This bourgeois class led those revolutions. However, once they came into power and solidified their rule, it quickly emerged that there were people excluded from this new form of rule. So the old democratic limit condition returns. And there are at least two different groups that right off the bat, very quickly, still within the lifetime of Locke, immediately began pointing out groups that he had excluded. The first was women. And so this is an interesting turn of events. Because Locke had said that rights fundamentally come from reason and from this sort of rational grounding in human nature, very quickly you have Mary Wollstonecraft as one of the very first people to make the following argument. If rights are supposed to come from rationality and from being a human being, on what grounds could you deny them to human beings? On what grounds could you deny this? In fact, it would be one thing if, as the aristocrats had argued for centuries, political power comes from inheritance. Okay, fine. Then it just wasn't handed down to women. But if you want to create this big revolution and say now that rights come from just being a human being and from reason, first of all, that starts to mean that we should confront the many centuries long exclusion of women from politics, and women should be allowed to vote. But second, and this is where Mary Wollstonecraft's real genius comes in, she says, all right, now let's say you try to make this very famous argument that, well, women have a different nature. Women are into womanly things. They don't have the mind for politics. They're just not capable of thinking that way. Wollstonecraft drives home this argument according to which that emerges from education. And so she hits liberal political theory right in its heart, arguing that the intimate connection between education and the right to democracy that crops up in Locke, and if we had read more Locke, you would have seen this in Locke already. But this division, this inequality, is actually generated by an educational pattern that's laid out both men and women into these unequal positions. And if that's actually true, if it is actually the result of social conditioning, then that social conditioning is also a political issue. And so the field of politics is no longer just the distribution of property, but it's also the creation of identities, how people are actually created, because how you create those identities determine how they can participate in politics. So those are the two big innovations that Mary Wollstonecraft put into place. But Mary Wollstonecraft, in making this analysis, is drawing on, in part, a very important critique of Locke that had been established by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And so to work backwards a little bit from Wollstonecraft, Rousseau's essay, the essay on equality that we're reading, is designed to really tear apart the idea that property is natural. And so Rousseau's idea is dedicated towards a different group of people who've been excluded. So if Wollstonecraft was looking at the way in which women have been excluded, Rousseau is looking at the way in which the propertyless, or the people who don't have property, have been excluded. And he sets out to show that against Locke, in fact, property is not natural at all and is the result of civilization, the result of a lot of processes, and in fact that property leads to war. Property leads to all of these terrible things. Property leads to the corruption of how we are naturally. In fact, naturally, Rousseau argues Locke made up his idea of what natural humanity is to serve his own purposes. And by putting property into the state of nature, Locke was committing a really fundamental fallacy. And so from that, Rousseau goes forward to show that Locke's, cherished social contract was actually a relation of force to try to control and keep the poor in their place, and it was sort of a strategy by the rich. But the implication from that is there's a second implication. So one is that the idea of property is fundamentally unjust. But the second implication, and here is where Wollstonecraft and Rousseau come together, is again that what it means to be human, human nature, is itself a constructed thing. It's something that's built by society rather than a given that society encounters. And because of that, Rousseau also puts a great emphasis on education. But we have to say that it's really Wollstonecraft who draws down the full implications of Rousseau's discovery on this point. And so Wollstonecraft and Rousseau together set up a new contradiction, if you will. So if with Locke, the sort of contradiction between Ireton and Rainsborough, between property and person, is brought together in this idea of the democracy of the propertied middle class, of the male propertied middle class within a certain country. Rousseau and Wollstonecraft bring up the idea of, first of all, the universality here has been insufficiently thought through, in that plenty of people are still excluded, and the reasons, the justifications for their exclusions are intrinsically contradictory. So the exclusion of women is contradictory because it's based on either something completely insane, if you admit that they're rational, or if you try to critique the rationality of women, it's based on something that's been socially generated. And in the context of Rousseau, the limit condition, property as a limit condition, is either based on a pseudo origin story of humanity, or, and equally, it leads to more inequality than it solves, and it makes the world more unjust. So these are the sort of contradictions going on with the liberal idea within itself. And stepping one step forward, Immanuel Kant, and this is the issue that finishes off our week, raises another question, which is, what are we going to do about the question of international justice? Because, all right, let's say this whole idea of liberal justice, of bourgeois rule, works well enough in an individual society. What are we going to do about the fact that we're constantly clashing with other societies, clashing with other, let's say, liberal societies, but other illiberal societies also? Is that going to be this realm of chaos? Is that outside of justice? Is it, like the Athenians once told the Melians, that between societies, justice is a question of force? And Kant argues that that's changing, and that we can now imagine an idea. We can now imagine an idea of global, international justice. And this is the first appearance of this idea of cosmopolitan justice, international justice. And Kant argues, what would it take if we agree that one of the things that government does within a society is to end the war within society, to make it there be no more wars within society, but instead a stable one? Could we do that on an international level? And that's what his essay, Perpetual Peace, is designed to ask, which is very sort of ingenious on Kant's part. He uses the idea of peace as a way to get at the idea of international justice. And so this is sort of the last limit that liberalism tries to handle and can still kind of handle on its own terms. So this is right at the edge. Liberalism is about to hit some barriers that it can't think about and remain liberal. But as long as it's thinking internationally, you get the moment of Kant. And there are two types of international justice, or rather there's what he calls international right, which is his proposal to make a federation of states, and there's cosmopolitan right, which is what he calls hospitality, or the right to visit different places. Now, on the one hand, hospitality is descended, well, let me just say quickly, that international one, the Federation of the States, is the ground and the inspiration for our contemporary United Nations. And so in some ways, Kant is very much our contemporary with this idea of the Federation of States, which is the inspiration for the United Nations. On the other hand, his idea of cosmopolitan right, which is that everyone has the right to at least visit any society anywhere and try to make a case for why they should be let in, brings us right up to the edge of the limit condition of liberal democracy. And the way in which you can see that most dramatically in the contemporary world is with the problem of the refugee. So the assignment for this weekend will have you reading some sources on the current refugee crisis in Europe. And it really pushes all the way to the limit whether Kant's solution is actually enough, whether Kant's solution actually does reconcile the global justice question, or whether, for instance, we do need a global state instead of merely a league of international states. Or maybe we can have a league of international states, but there need to be more cosmopolitan rights than just hospitality. Or maybe war is unavoidable forever and we're trapped and we can't have any justice whatsoever on a cosmopolitan level. So this is very much, these are questions that are very live. I mean, now with Kant and the question of the refugees, our course is able to really shift into thinking about issues that are very much immediately part of our present world. I hope you enjoy the readings this week, and I hope you really pay close attention to them, because now we're really reading things that directly bear on our current society. And so the stakes, as ever, are quite high. In any case, I look forward to reading your responses. I wish you luck, and let's talk soon. Have a great week, everybody. Take care.